You know, the biblical chapter of Deuteronomy 28 has some of the most intense and honestly terrifying curses you'll find anywhere in ancient literature. For a lot of people, these words are a unique prophecy, almost like a divine fingerprint, pointing to a specific people's destiny. But what if that's not the whole story? What if these curses aren't unique at all, but were actually part of a common, widespread tradition in the ancient world? Let's decode this.
So let's start with this one verse, Deuteronomy 28:68. It is incredibly powerful. Today, it's become a real cornerstone for interpretations that connect these curses to very specific historical events, especially the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And you can see why, right? The imagery is just so vivid, so potent. It feels like it has to be a prophetic fingerprint.
And that really brings us to the heart of the matter. Are we looking at a totally unique prophecy aimed at a particular group thousands of years in the future? Or what if we peel back the layers of history? Will we find that this text is actually speaking the common legal and political language of its own time? Let's dig in.
All right, so here's our game plan to get to the bottom of this. First, we're going to look at that modern prophetic interpretation. Then, we'll take a trip back in time to the world of ancient treaties to find the text's original DNA. From there, we'll see how these curses were part of a loyalty ritual, how you could actually reverse them, and finally, we'll track how their meaning got totally reinterpreted over time. Okay, first things first. It's really important to get why the modern interpretation is so powerful. A lot of groups today read the curses in Deuteronomy 28 as a direct prophecy that was fulfilled in events like the Transatlantic Slave Trade. For them, this text becomes a permanent marker of identity. But to really test that claim, we've got to go back to the world where it was written.
So, we have to kind of leave our 21st century mindset behind and travel back to the 7th century BCE. This was the age of empires, and the big player on the block was the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They were this huge, dominant power that controlled a massive territory, including the little kingdoms of Israel and Judah.
So how did an empire like Assyria keep all its subjects in line? Well, one of their main tools was something called a vassal treaty. The best way to think of it is as a binding legal contract. The emperor, the big boss, lays out the terms for a smaller, weaker kingdom, the vassal. And this wasn't a friendly negotiation, it was a hardcore loyalty oath, a promise not to rebel that was backed up by some seriously severe penalties.
Now, this timeline is absolutely crucial. The tradition of using these specific curse formulas in political treaties was already old news before Deuteronomy 28 was ever written down. We've got Aramaic treaties from the 8th century and the super famous succession treaties from the Assyrian king Esarhaddon in 672 BCE. Deuteronomy shows up right in the middle of all this when this kind of legal language was just the international standard.
And look, this isn't just a theory. We have the receipts. These are the sapphire steles. They're actual stone monuments with Aramaic vassal treaties carved into them from the 8th century BCE. And when scholars finally translated them, they found something mind-blowing, curse formulas that sounded almost exactly like the ones we find in the Bible.
So, this lets us do some real detective work. We can put the text from Deuteronomy right next to these other ancient documents and start looking for textual fingerprints. And let me tell you, the similarities go deep.
First, just look at the overall structure, the blueprint. Ancient vassal treaties almost always followed the same pattern. You get a little history, then the rules, and then a list of blessings if you're loyal and curses if you rebel. And what do we find in Deuteronomy? The exact same structure. It's the legal framework of a political treaty. Okay, and here it is. This is the smoking gun. On the left, you have what are called futility curses from an 8th century Aramaic treaty. On the right, curses from Deuteronomy 28. It's almost word for word. So much but reap little. Build a house but not live in it. This isn't just a similar idea. This is a shared, formulaic legal threat. It's boilerplate language.
And that gets to the key point. It's not that the authors of Deuteronomy were just copying one specific treaty. It's more like they were using the shared legal and scribal language of the entire region. This was the professional dialect, you know? Scribes all over the Neo-Assyrian Empire were trained in these specific, formulaic traditions for writing up loyalty oaths. It was their legal template.
So now that we know where the language came from, we can ask an even deeper question. What were these curses actually for? What were they designed to do? Well, their purpose wasn't to predict the distant future. It was all about shaping people's behavior right here, right now.
You have to picture it. These treaties weren't just dusty old documents. They were brought to life in huge public ceremonies. The Bible itself describes how making a covenant worked. You'd build an altar, make sacrifices, and, this is the crucial part,
publicly recite the laws, the blessings, and the curses. The entire community would hear these words spoken out loud to make sure everyone stayed loyal.
And to give these oaths some real cosmic power, they called in witnesses. Treaties from all across the ancient Near East would call on heaven and earth to be the divine guarantors. The idea was basically that the entire universe was co-signing the contract, and if you broke it, the cosmos itself would come after you to enforce the penalties.
This really gets to the core of what a curse was in this world. It was a conditional self-curse. When you swore the oath, you were pretty much saying, I swear I'll do this, and may all these horrible things happen to me if I break my promise. It was a guarantee, backed by the threat of divine punishment that you called down on yourself.
Okay, now this is where things get really fascinating. If these curses were part of a ritual system that you could activate, was there also a way to turn them off? Was there an undo button?
I mean, it makes sense, right? If you can get into a binding, cursed-backed agreement through a special ritual, shouldn't there be another ritual to get you out of it? Well, it turns out the answer is a big, resounding yes.
Archaeologists have found entire libraries of Neo-Assyrian incantation texts, with names like Maklu and Shirpu. And what were they for? They were detailed, complex ceremonies a priest would perform for one specific reason: to free someone from the bad effects of a curse, especially a curse that got triggered by breaking an oath.
So you see this perfect symmetry. The very same culture that used rituals to turn curses on also had rituals to turn them off. This tells us that curses were seen as manageable, present-day problems, not as some unchangeable, multi-generational destiny. They were legal tools, and they had corresponding legal remedies.
So that's the original context: legal, political, and ritual. But we all know that texts and ideas don't stay frozen in time. Their meanings change. So let's jump forward a few hundred years and see how this whole concept of the curse got completely transformed.
When we get to the New Testament, we see a totally radical reinterpretation. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Galatians, takes this idea of the curse of the law, that penalty for being disobedient, and he puts it into a brand new theological framework. He argues that this curse is something believers are rescued or redeemed from. And this just lays out the shift perfectly. The original curse in Deuteronomy was a specific, legal penalty for breaking a political covenant. But in the book of Galatians, it becomes a metaphor for a universal spiritual problem. The meaning has totally shifted from a concrete, legal punishment to an abstract, theological idea. And that leaves us with one final, really powerful question to think about. When we uncover the historical world a text was born in, it doesn't just erase all its modern meanings, but it does challenge us. How does knowing this text's original job as a political loyalty oath, using the standard legal language of its time, how does that change the way we read it as a prophecy for our own world? That's something worth wrestling with.